You're the moderator.
Maybe it's time for...
Okay, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I've been coming here since 1975. I feel a need to say that because usually what happens after a talk, somebody comes up to me and says, so is this your first visit to Malaysia? My wife and I were here so often in the 1990s that at the Shangri-La, they not only knew us by name, but they knew what we wanted for breakfast. So it's, we've been coming here a long time. My great memory of ISIS was years ago, being asked to speak on U.S. Middle East policy. It was probably the hottest session I've ever been in the Muslim world. And we had a full contingent from the American embassy. And so I felt the need before it to say that I certainly wasn't representing necessarily the viewpoints of my government. But that was a very good time for me. And of course, I have two very good friends and super senior scholars whom all of you know but should celebrate because not only of their contributions to Malaysia, but their incredible international reputations. I'm going to talk today about American Muslims and the future of relations between the Muslim world and the West. But I'm going to begin with a profile of American Muslims so we have a sense of who they are. My experience is that lots of people in the Muslim world really don't know very much about the American Muslim community, or sometimes what they think they know isn't quite accurate. This isn't really too different from many people in America. Let me begin with one statement, and that is we don't know how many Muslims there are in America. We have absolutely no idea. That is, the statistics don't work. Until maybe 5 years ago, the tendency was to say that there were about 6 to 8 million Muslims. That was based on the fact that I and two other people said something like that in the New York Times, and then that gets quoted by somebody else, and by the third time it becomes a fact. Now the numbers vary anywhere from 2.5 to 10 million. In fact, sometimes from 1.5 to 12 million. So I would say realistically, conservatively speaking, there would be 4 to 6 million Muslims. The Pew people talk about 2.5 million, but there are lots of questions about the way in which they count Muslims in America. Nearly 2/3 of Muslim Americans are under 50 years of age. Nearly 3/5 are college graduates, and I think that's very important. There's an enormous difference between Muslims in America and Muslims in Europe. Muslims in America, to begin with, about 1/3 are African American, or what we might call indigenous Muslims. 2/3 are immigrant Muslims. Of the immigrant Muslims, most came with professions, seeking a better future, political asylum, etc. And many others came initially for education, and like Dr. Awan sitting in the front, wound up staying in the United States. The fellow with the terrific red tie, and if he is a gentleman, he knows that now he has to give me that tie. I happened to say that with an American diplomat who had served in Malaysia at a public meeting, and after it he came up and gave me his tie, and it's one of the nicer ties I received. But in any case, and I also like to admire women's rings, so you want to be careful if I pay you a compliment. But the reality of it is, what we therefore have is a very professional class. So for example, it's estimated now that American Muslims are not only economically integrated into America, but that in fact the average American Muslim family makes more than the average American non-Muslim family. Now that's complete contrast with Europe. In Europe, the vast majority of Muslims came from the 60s on, and many of those were blue-collar workers. And indeed, that's still very much the situation. If you go not only to the UK and France, but if you go to Denmark, if you go to Sweden, lots of places. And so you have, or France, and so you have another difference, which is that in America, if I talk about the immigrant Muslims, you have no ghettos, no economic ghettos, as it were. Whereas, as we know, in France and in other parts of Europe, you have ghetto areas or total if you will, total Muslim areas. I'm using ghetto in two different ways if I were to use it. One would be where it's a total Muslim area. The other way of using ghetto in America is where it's a very poor area. And also then you have that contrast with regard to issues of crime and drugs, etc., that often plague communities that are marginalized socially, educationally, in terms of housing. So there's a considerable difference. The other characteristic about the American Muslim community is that we probably have close to maybe 80 countries represented. Some people have said we probably have more diversity of Muslims in America than any place in the world in terms of permanent citizens. Now, in terms of religion, this also becomes interesting. When you talk about, for example, Muslims in America or in Europe, for those who are Islamophobic, for those who are anti-Muslim in some way or another, they have this fixation on how many Muslims there are, almost like how many enemies there are. So, for example, in the United States, if you say there are so many Jews or so many Christians, nobody presumes that all those Jews and Christians are exactly the same or that they're even religiously observant. But with Muslims, there is that presumption. I mean, I test that with audiences all the time. If you say we have so many Muslims, their presumption is, well, then if you have that many, you certainly need a lot of mosques because they're all going to mosque, they're all, observant. In fact, in terms of negative attitudes of some Americans, you will find that, for example, 57% of Americans, and I may come back to this later, when asked what do they admire about Islam, say nothing or I don't know. Okay? But then you'll get a significant percentage of Americans who will say, when they characterize Muslims as, well, they're very strong believers. And as I say to my Muslim friends, that's the good news. The bad news is they think that's a problem. That if in fact you are very observant, that's an issue. This is not going to be completely germane to the thrust of my talk, but it's relevant to understanding the place of the American Muslim community and the role of religion. For example, people will be very concerned, obviously in Europe, which is very secular, they're very concerned about any form of religion. And therefore, if they wind up with Muslims who seem, very much involved in their faith, that's an issue for secularists. It's also an issue for Pope Benedict in some way or in some ways, with regard to Germany and other church leaders. But the reality of it is that, for example, with the Gallup World Poll, which I'll refer to after, which is the largest, most comprehensive poll of Muslims in the world, encompassing some 40 Muslim countries, as well as data from Britain, France, and Germany. We talk about the fact that majorities of Muslims around the world want some form of Sharia. They want to see their religious values as present in their society. Well, the interesting thing is, when Americans wonder about that, if they consider the fact that more than a majority of Americans believe that the laws of America should be based on the Bible. Now, even many Americans are surprised at that. Okay? But it gives you also a different sense of the context in which Muslims are living. That is, in America, Muslims are living in a society in which vast majorities of Americans, sometimes into the 90 percentile, say that in one way or another they are religious. It's a great contrast with Europe. So the context of American Muslims, socioeconomically, in terms of the diversity, etc., I think is important to note here. One of the side effects in terms of the American Muslim community, which is beginning to change, but in the old days that showed the issue of integration, not so much in terms of American Muslims into the society, but rather in terms of American Muslims within the Muslim community itself, was that in some cities you have what I call more mosques than Muslims, i.e. because mosques come up along ethnic lines. So you'll have a Turkish mosque, a Pakistani mosque, etc. It's not totally foreign to our experience. Years ago, in some cities, you would have on one corner a Catholic church that was French American, and across the street a Catholic church that was Irish American. And then you would have the one true Catholic church that was Italian American. But that's changing. We now come together. And certainly we have, for example, mosques that are more African American in approach. But interestingly, in terms of religion, most Muslims in America identify themselves as just Muslims. They don't some do distinguish Sunni and Shia, and certainly the mosques are distinguished that way. But in many conversations with most Muslims, they will just talk in terms of the fact that they are, quote, just Muslims, particularly as they become more integrated. Now, but only 31% attend mosque on a weekly basis. 16% attend once or twice a month. 27% they seldom or never attend. I'm happy to tell you that Osman was among the 31% at least who attended mosque on a weekly basis, because we kept an eye on him while he was at Georgetown. But just in case you're wondering what percentage he fell into. The largest segment of respondents, though, to polls said that they consider themselves just Muslims and wish to avoid the distinction between Sunni and Shia. Now, what about the issue of, and I think this is very important in terms of the development of Islam, of Muslims in America, and the development of Islamic thought potentially globally. And I'll explain what I mean by this. A phenomenon that we see in America with other faiths, but I'll give you the example that's clearest in my mind, is that of Roman Catholicism. Catholicism, when it came to America, came from various Catholic countries and from a history and culture in which to be a Catholic was primarily to live in a Catholic country, in a Catholic society, not to live as a minority. Okay. When Catholics came to America, they lived as a minority. Now, but one of the problems Catholics had, historically, is that there was no sense of what it meant to be a religious minority. And so Catholics who had a problem dealing themselves, Catholic majority countries, dealing with religious minorities, suddenly what Catholics had to deal with was the shoes on the other foot. What is it like to be a minority? And suddenly a minority that wants to be treated equally. And it took decades until Vatican II, but at Vatican II, you had a major document where for the first time the Vatican and the Catholic Church recognized religious pluralism, recognized officially Islam and other faiths. And this was totally unique, and that document was written by two prominent American Catholic theologians. So it came out of the American experience. So whereas in the old days, the influence always came from Rome, or from, if you will, Catholic Europe to America, that's where our priests came from initially, our nuns, our theology, our ideas. Then you began to get this bounce back effect, where major theologians came to be Americans and their ideas, particularly on things like pluralism. Now, I say that as an introduction to the perception of Muslims with regard to religious pluralism and tolerance. And I think this is very interesting. 97% of Muslims surveyed believe they should donate to non-Muslim social service programs. See, that's when it becomes significant. You can move pluralistically in terms of your theology, but the question is, when it comes to giving money, do you still only feel that you only give money to your own social service groups? Or do you feel that you belong to a bigger community, and that in a way, it's not only your community obligation, but your religious obligation? And I think that this is reflected in a variety of ways. 90% say Muslims should participate in interfaith activities. This is an enormous change. I was active in the beginnings of interfaith, both internationally and in the United States. At the time, I didn't even think we would do anything all that special, because I didn't realize nothing had been going on before. But initially, there was great reluctance. Catholics had a problem getting involved in dialogue, and Muslims had a similar problem. Both were, but at different times. Catholics earlier. Both were concerned that dialogue would mean losing or giving up part of one's faith. That somehow the other expected to lecture or to give a khutbah, this way, rather than a real exchange. The question was, why do they want to talk to us? I mean, if we each know and believe in what we believe, what are we going to talk about? And, what's the end of this dialogue? That has changed enormously now in terms of American Muslims. And so, for example, this is ironic, whereas Protestants were the leaders in dialogue internationally and in the United States, in dialoguing with Muslims. Today, Catholics are, certainly in the United States, the most productive. We, in fact, run at Georgetown. We've been running an institute first for priests to learn about Islam, then last year, 2 years ago, priests and ministers, and this year, for the first time, priests, ministers, and Muslims. It's like a bad joke, actually, but we haven't developed a joke yet. So what we do is we have the Christians work on Islam, we have Muslims working on Christianity, and then they come together for joint sessions. So things have come, a long way. We've got marriage manuals developed jointly by Muslims and Catholics. 85% of Muslims say the influence of religion and moral values in American public life should increase. 87% say Muslims should financially support worthy non-Muslim political candidates. That's the other thing that happens. When you're a minority, when you start to get involved in the political system, you generally then vote blindly for your group. You get the first Italian going in. I remember when Scalia became a member of the Supreme Court. Very difficult for me. I admire the man intellectually, politically, and in terms of his legal approach. We're in two different places. But the idea that you had an Italian American who was on the Supreme Court, the first one, that's a big thing. Just as for many Catholics, when Kennedy ran, there are many Catholics who I'm sure voted for Kennedy because he was Catholic. Putting aside, I'm proud to say in a straw vote, I voted for Nixon. I was not very popular when I did that. And I did it while I was in a Catholic monastery, which made it even more of a problem, and an Irish Catholic monastery. But in any case, 84% said Muslims should strongly emphasize shared values with Christians and Jews. Shared values. 77% said Muslims worship the same God as Christians and Jews. All of that, as many of my Muslim brothers and sisters here know, is a remarkable movement. That wasn't the case when many Muslims came early on. Many years ago, it doesn't happen now, but 20 years ago, I was asked to give a talk to Catholics on how to reach out to Muslims, and to give a talk at ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, on how to do da'wah among Christians. And I remember having to say to some of the Muslims that day, I said, the way you do dialogue is you don't do this kind of dialogue. You don't walk in and slap a Christian across the face verbally by coming in and say, now I'm going to tell you, look, your faith is false. How can you believe in something like the Trinity? It makes no sense. Let me tell you the truth. Let me tell you about Islam. Because what I was trying to say is that too many people were kind of doing that. The way in which in the old days, Christian missionaries would in effect come in and say, your country's weak because of your religion. Let me tell you what true religion looks like. This situation of Muslims becoming economically integrated is also being seen by a kind of cultural integration, which doesn't mean that Muslims give up their belief in who they are, but it does mean that they emphasize shared values. They underscore, as Christians would want, and Jews, their differences, but they also embrace the idea that we live in a pluralistic society and that we live in that society. So, for example, unlike years ago, when you talk about new generations of Muslims, they don't live, as the younger generation used to say to me, my family lives in denial. And you say, what's the denial? Well, they deny the fact that they've lived here for 40 years. They act like they're going to go back and die in Pakistan. They deny the fact that they're going to, that we're really citizens here. And that was difficult for many, because for that generation that was born here, was at UCLA, but yet when there were riots in the Los Angeles ghetto, and they said to their parents, we need to do something, and the parents said, well, why? It's not like they're fellow citizens. That situation's changed enormously. All right, so now you have a sense of the Muslim community. Now let's talk a little bit about its integration politically, and then I can talk about the question of Muslim clout politically and where do we go in the future. A major survey shows that Muslims were integrated into American society in the following ways. 89% they said they vote regularly. 89%. I never thought it would move that fast. Never thought it would move that fast. 10 years ago, you wouldn't even be talking about that. 10 years ago, you'd be talking about the fact that you couldn't get enough Muslims to register. 10 years ago, you would have an Indian friend of mine a former student of mine, who literally would say to groups of Muslims when he would speak to them, he'd say, "So you're going up for your citizenship test. I guess you're going to tell them when you go up and you do the questions that America's a kuffar country, right? You're going to tell them you're kuffar because you wouldn't lie. That's what you believe, so you're not going to lie. So you're going to tell them they're kuffar and you're going to expect to get the citizenship, okay?" That climate has changed tremendously, okay? But this is the same young man who's from South Asia. I tell this story in the Arab world, but it gets a little bit more awkward. Who was known to say to a group of Arab students who were going on about how to be Arab is to be Muslim and to be Muslim is to be Arab, you know, that the Arabs are the center of Islam. And he said, "You don't get it. The miracle of Islam is that God revealed the Quran to the Arabs and Islam still survived and spread as a world religion." So he's known to be contentious on a number of points, but that was one of his better moments. Okay, Muslims desire greater political participation. 95% say Muslims should participate in the political process. 86% say it's important for them to participate in politics itself. Again, rather than saying we'll stay out of it, you know, kind of like this is my adopted country, but it's not really completely my country. And also, if I'm a non-Muslim and I'm living in a predominantly Christian or secular country, then how much do I participate in the politics? Can I really vote for all of these people who aren't Muslim, who aren't going to have necessarily the same values that I do? 2 in 3 Muslims say they follow what's going on in government and public affairs. Nearly 7 in 10 say being a Muslim is important in their voting decision. Now, where it gets even more interesting is the issue of foreign policy versus domestic policy. And here there's a significant change as compared to only a few years ago. When I moved to Washington in 1993, I was asked to chair a session at the National Press Club. And it was a session in which Muslim organizations were co-sponsoring, and the idea was to assure America that Islam is not the next threat, okay? This is 1993-94. So we have the presentations, National Press Club. You have a lot of people there at the time. There was Senator, ex-Senator Percy, and other people in the audience. Question and answer period comes up. One Muslim after the other lines up, and they all walk up to the mic and start denouncing American foreign policy. One after the other, shouting into the mic. Okay? Now, they had C-SPAN there. The idea was they wanted America not to feel that Islam and Muslims are the next threat. And I had to point out to them that for the average American sitting there, if you now have Muslims who get up and they don't begin by saying that they're American citizens, that they're glad to be here, you know, it's a good country, but you know, it's not in America's interest to hold this policy, but simply get up and denounce the policy, then it looks like they're simply foreigners who are simply concerned about foreign issues. What we now find is that 44% of Muslim surveys say that domestic policy is the most important factor, whereas 34% said foreign policy. Now that doesn't take away from the fact that if you talk to any American Muslim group, they are concerned about Palestine, they're concerned about Iraq, etc. But again, it shows the nature of political integration. Okay. Views on U.S. foreign policy, last but not least. Muslims overwhelmingly back changing U.S. policy. I like that phrase. It sounds like this positive flow, you know, overwhelmingly back changing U.S. policy in the Mideast as the best way to move forward. Now, in that sense, American Muslims are completely in line with Muslims worldwide. In a Gallup poll, it's the largest, most comprehensive poll of Muslims ever done and the most systematic. When Americans are asked about the Muslim world, do they think Muslims care about the relationship between America and the Muslim world? A majority say no. When Muslims globally are asked, do they think Americans care? A majority say no. And the fact is, they're both wrong, because both care. And it's only a minority that doesn't care. But, and this will dovetail with the domestic Muslim attitude. But when asked, what shall we do? Both sides agree on the first two things. More education, not only in our educational institutions, but in society. Okay? More education about the other, okay? And exchange, massive exchanges. But for Americans, it stops there. For majorities of Americans, they think that's enough. I mean, that's what you would do. For majorities of Muslims, there's a third factor, and that's the foreign policy side. It's connected not only with foreign policy, but also with what majorities of Muslims say is what they resent the most, and that is the denigration of Islam. What they see is the denigration of Islam and of Muslims, somehow seeing them as second class. And then following from that, feeling that Muslims are more vulnerable to intervention, invasion, dependency, etc. But what we see here is that domestic American Muslims and Muslims overseas all see as part of the way forward, not just the need to know each other better and to do the education and exchange side, but the foreign policy side. And the other part of it is that 69%, as is true for many Muslims worldwide, believe that the Palestinian cause is very important, a just resolution of that to future relations. 55% are afraid that the war on terror has become a war on Islam. So here they identify with the global Muslim community, and they identify with what is emerging more and more, the concern of the community in Europe. Certainly in a place like the UK, where I just came from, and other places. The UK just had Islam Expo for the second time, and about a week before, you suddenly had some of the top anti-Muslim journalists writing about Hamas Islam Expo. As a result, at the last minute, 7 or 8 government officials had to withdraw from appearing at Islam Expo, including Shahid Malik, who had to withdraw, who's a member of the government, the first cabinet member. A major concern of American Muslims is clearly, of many, is civil liberties. Civil liberties. And again, our context is so different than Europe. And this is my last comment as I dovetail it into the question of the Muslim community moving forward, but it's important for you to understand the nature of that Muslim community. You know, in Europe, as a result of the attacks in Europe, there's a real concern about embedded cells, about the degree of terrorism, both in terms of those who come into the country as well as those who've been born in the country and have been influenced by either radical clerics or have gone back to countries like Pakistan for a while and come back. That issue in the US is negligible. It is being raised, and it's been raised consistently, but the reality of it is that post 9/11, between 5,000 and 6,000 people are arrested. A terrific book on this, by the way, is a book called Less Safe, Less Free, by David Cole, who teaches at Georgetown Law School, who's an authority on these issues. Less safe, less free. What David points out is that of the 5,000 or 6,000 arrested, virtually none of them were found guilty of terrorism. The FBI brought 80,000 people in for interviews, no major problem. Investigations of mosques, monitoring of mosques, no major problem. So very different than the European situation. And yet, on the other hand, significant problems with issues of profiling, with issues of arresting being held under the Secret Evidence Act. The classic case is Dr. Sami al-Arian, whose case is continuing. So many American Muslims are concerned about the issue of civil liberties. As 2 of my Muslim students had their homes raided about 2 years ago in Virginia, their family homes. And as one of them said to me, her father had left Iraq during Saddam's time, maybe 30 years ago. She said, you know, my father left the country because that this kind of thing could happen. And here it was, you know, in the middle of the night, our house was, you know, broken into, as it were, etc. We went through what we went through. So the issue of civil liberties is there. And we have, as you know, some interesting situations. Shahid Malik was invited by Homeland Security 2 years ago to a conference on terrorism and then was grilled. Then he came to Georgetown about 4 months ago, spoke at Georgetown, and was on his way to Dulles Airport. And I kiddingly said, well, have a good time at the airport, meaning nothing will happen. The next morning I woke up and in the Washington Post, Shahid Malik had been stopped again. So that issue is there for American Muslims. Now, they're not the first community to face this. During World War II, there were signs that said of Japanese, of Germans, and of Italians, don't speak the enemy's language. And we know that the Japanese suffered even more than that. So that reality and concern is there. Now, having said all of this, what can we say about the American Muslim community and the situation with regard to its contribution with regard to the future in terms of American relations with the Muslim world? Well, let's start with what is right now a very complex reality in America, which I'll treat with very briefly, and then I'll draw a conclusion, and then we can go to questions and answers. The reality of it is that the candidacy of Obama has surfaced part of the problem that we have in America and Europe. That is that there is a kind of Islamophobic trend. It's not where the majority of Americans are necessarily coming from. Majorities of Americans will say they don't know enough about Islam. Majority will say they don't know much about, they're not sure what they would admire. They're leery, but it doesn't mean that, majorities necessarily are anti-Muslim, in a kind of aggressive way. Certainly we have political commentators who are. I'm writing, hopefully finishing a new book called The Future of Islam. And between the US and the UK, you don't even have to go beyond that. Some of the diatribes out there, are incredible. The kinds of things that you could not say about any other faith or group or race, will be said. But the Obama candidacy has surfaced some of this. That is this almost abnormal concern, no matter what Obama says, with whether or not he's a Muslim. And the continuing concern. The fact that 10%, and now in last month it went up to 12% of Americans, despite all the data out there, still believe that he's a Muslim. The fact that Obama himself feels that he has to keep a distance from the Muslim community. The fact that he appointed an outreach person for Muslim affairs. That person resigned within 1 week because of attacks on the internet. It shows you that that's still a very kind of sensitive issue. On the other hand, American Muslims have emerged as a small but considerable vote. They're still marginalized by some groups that are nervous about their influence. To be very blunt, there are groups within the American Jewish lobby that are concerned that if American Muslims look like they have a large percentage and a lot of political clout in a lobby culture like ours, they'll have more influence. It's like the vying between Pakistanis and Indians, or Greeks and Turks in a lobby system. Do your numbers, do you have more clout? What will that amount to? So that is an issue that has to be dealt with. But one can certainly say that in the election of President Bush the first time, American Muslims played an important role in states like Florida and other states. And certainly in this election, if it gets close, in Virginia, in Florida, in Michigan, in Minnesota, if it gets very close, there are enough Muslims there that they can make a difference in the vote. So I think that's a reality that more and more will be dealt with. We now have 2 members of Congress, Keith Ellison, and then a second member who has just come in, taking the seat of his grandmother, and who I think has a good shot at being elected in his own right. In terms of relations in the future, a lot is going to have to depend upon the development of American Muslim lobbies, and that's been a bit of a problem. That is that when you get American Muslim groups emerging with any kind of significance, people try to chop their head off. In other words, as soon as they become significant, people immediately begin to say they're somehow militant. Classic example is when President Clinton and then President Bush had the same problem. A slight variation, but somewhat similar. President Clinton was the first one to have iftars, for Muslims to invite them. And the first iftar was arranged by a group on the East Coast. Immediately in the Wall Street Journal, there were op-eds about how this group had ties to radical groups. So the next year they went to a California group, MPAC. Immediately, Wall Street Journal, same people writing, saying, look at who they're relying on. President Bush had an iftar. I'm not good on President Bush's iftars. I've only gone to one. I've been invited to a number, but I'm not an expert on this. But his first iftar, his second iftar was a little different than the first iftar. And when I went to the second iftar, I said to some Muslims at the table, what's different about this one? And they said, it's the Muslims who were here, who weren't here last year, and the Muslims who aren't here, who were here last year. In other words, you know, the pot gets stirred, and then people get nervous about, you know, people start calling in and saying, well, are you sure so-and-so's okay? So the issue as you emerge as a strong lobby group is that other lobby groups who might have a concern, for example, AIPAC, the American Jewish Lobby, will not want to see these other lobbies step out front and be strong. So, but as that begins to develop, as American Muslims become, for example, more successful, and that's happening in local areas where American Muslims can initially have more clout is in local office. You run for city council or mayor. This is also true in the UK. You have, you know, lots of Muslims who become sort of, mayors of localities. So where there is influence is that members of Congress more and more, not all, but a fair number, have to deal with those constituencies. I put it this way, and regrettably I told this story and then somebody repeated it immediately after it in another situation. But about 10 years ago, the Islamic Society of North America had an event with the Cardinal of Baltimore, okay, who was a big player in that time in terms of the American Catholic Church. And at that event, 2 congressmen came, and they looked nervous, just the way they walked into the room. And then they sat next to me on the stage. I mean, one of them, his palm was kind of perspiring a little. Now, he was a professional, but they suddenly discovered they had an important Muslim minority. They're invited to this Muslim affair, and, you know, they clearly didn't know what to do. It's like, you know, you come in and you know, you're kind of, who's going to bring you in, who's going to introduce you? And as happens in a lot of situations, somebody walks in and nobody comes up to them. So then they're kind of wandering around the room, and then they've got to give a little speech, and the guy's sitting next to me, and he's kind of, in a sense, sort of saying, I don't know what to say. In other words, he's not saying to himself, this is another constituency, and I'll respond to it. You know, as I would to any constituency, or I know enough about it, if it's an American Jewish constituency or Italian, that I'm comfortable, you know. I mean, instead he's dealing here with Muslim and multi-ethnic. That's changed a lot now. You now have, you know, members of Congress and others who are far more sophisticated. So in terms of influence on American politics and American politics towards the Muslim world and relations, on the one hand, I think American Muslims make great ambassadors, so they come over and give talks and they can talk about their experience. On the other, unlike before 9/11, they're going to be honest ambassadors if they're any good, and they're going to tell you that America's a great place to be, but it's not as great as it was before, that some of them are worried about issues of civil liberties, issues of employment. You know, you do have situations where in professional situations, in some situations, people continue to hire, you know, without a problem. In others, I've known law firms where actually people have said very honestly to somebody, I'm really sorry, but this kind of position is very public relations and, you know, kind of given your name, etc., there can be a bit of a problem. That situation exists. My own center, the fact that we receive money from Prince Al-Walid bin Talal means that you're subject to people saying you have Saudi money, or even that it's the Saudi government, and it's not Saudi government money. It means that you experience. But I think that American Muslims in general, still, you know, the majority of them, while some have left the country because they're concerned, the majority of them feel that, you know, they've put down their roots. They are economically integrated. They're more and more becoming politically integrated. And the extent to which that happens means that they become better voices in terms of relations overseas. The extent to which, for example, Irish Americans are embedded in America, although that word embedded now has a negative ring. But I'm anti-Irish, so that's not a problem. The extent to which Italian Americans, Indian Americans, here I mean people from India, you know, or Greek Americans, you know, really, then they do have influence when it comes to policies that have to do with overseas. So I think that that's really where we're at now. I'll bring that to a close and be happy to handle any questions you might have. Thank you.
Professor John Esposito began to tell us that there is no distinction or such a great awareness between the Sunni and Shia Muslim. In fact, this is representative of the general trend that we have been witnessing in the last half a century or even more, that the lines of convergence are much greater, the differences are really minor, and the sense of unity, the kind of quest and need for greater unity, this is the impulse that is really alive among Muslims, and American Muslims really represent that sentiment. We were also told that they have shown a great inclination, the Muslims of America, to participate in the general run of life as good citizens. Not only token participation, but in real terms, that they want to be part of the services and to donate to non-Muslim activities and so on. This is also representative, in fact, of normative Islam. We have a religious tax, zakat, which is a poor due, but the rules of Sharia tells us that all poor people living wherever they live, among Muslims or anywhere, non-Muslims and non-Muslims, are entitled to zakat. And this is the charity that Muslims give, and non-Muslims are entitled to it. So in that sense, they are also really representing the normative values of Islam. We have recognition, a very visible recognition of the commonalities of values between the great religions in the Quran. Sometimes it is understood that the expression Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, is understood to signify some kind of sentiment that does not really tally with what it actually should mean, because Kitab is the name the Quran also designates for itself. Ahl al-Kitab, we are also the Ahl al-Kitab. All of us are. In fact, the Quran recognizes the validity of Bible in Torah. The messages that are given, they are replicated in many ways. And it is actually our history in the normative values that we have, in the historical trends, have not always been corresponding with one another. And it is also somewhat of an unhappy patch that we have been witnessing in recent years. But I think that there is also a greater awareness, as we have seen in the evidence presented, that the Muslims everywhere, they have shown greater willingness and demanded for a positive pattern of relationship, that there is a need for revising this pattern. We have always had so much appreciation of the good values of the American and Western experiences in governance and human rights, and the protections that are offered for the values that we cherish in common, and also the kind of the spirituality and moral virtue. There is so much in common. Why have we not actually lived that in real life, in the history been such that we have highlighted more the differences and not the commonalities? Perhaps there is something, a prospect on which we should perhaps focus more and pay greater attention. With these comments, I think that I will not take more time, but open the floor for discussion. And those of you who have, I have 2 hands, one request that I may make 3 hands, is that a question or a comment should be distinguished. And when I raise this half-folded paper that you are extending question or comment, it's a sign that you should wind up. Well, I think that maybe I'm speaking prematurely, but it's open to the floor.
I prefer this signal. It's much clearer.
Yes. Okay. Yes, Professor.
May I first begin by congratulating my dear friends, Professor Kamali and Professor Osman Bakr, and their associates on the fact that they now have this beautiful building and on the launching of their activities here in this brilliant fashion with Professor Esposito. Professor Esposito, it's a pleasure seeing you again and listening to you speaking in your, shall we say, very special manner, very clear, very informative, very enlightening. I have a couple of questions, very briefly. When I was in Temple a few years ago, visiting there, in the 80s actually, and more recently in Indiana, I got the impression, and this is something that I would like to ask your opinion about, that one of the problems that Muslim immigrants have in America is that many of them bring the baggage of differences that they used to have in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Iran, in North Africa, various parts of the Muslim world, etc., and do not actually integrate effectively either with other Muslims in the states across these traditional barriers, or with the larger community as one would have expected. And this seemed to me to be particularly clear when comparing Jewish immigrants, whether Jewish immigrants come from Poland or Russia, or from Egypt or the Sudan or Iraq or have you, they seem to integrate much more effectively among the other Jews who are already there, American Jews, as well as with American people generally. I don't know what your own perspective on this would be. And secondly, another very small question. I have the impression, especially since 9/11, that within the academic associations, Middle Eastern studies, etc., people like your good self have recently had a very hard time. People who want to address issues about Islam and Muslims and America and the West, etc., objectively, with a profound understanding and academic integrity. And many of them have had a hard time and continue to suffer, just as Muslims generally do. Is the situation still as bad as I felt it was some 2 or 3 years ago, or is it easing a bit? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are good questions. Should I answer that, or do you want to take? Can I answer that right now?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. You're absolutely right. The question of culture and the link of culture with religion is an issue, and has been an issue in America as it is in Europe. One example that I would give is a friend of ours who is Sudanese, married an American woman. This is, maybe 15 years ago, maybe longer than that, maybe 20 years ago. And we went to the wedding. She was dressed modestly, in what one would see as sort of American fashion, but dressed modestly. And then she asked to see me. And she came to see me, and she was dressed, quote, Islamically. This is the way she portrayed it. And I said to her, why did you change your dress? I mean, you were dressed modestly each way. She said, well, my husband's friends convinced me that I needed to dress more like a Muslim woman, more Islamically. I said, no, they convinced you to dress like a Sudanese woman. I said, if you were Bengali, if you were in Bangladesh, you would have dressed differently. If you were, in Egypt, you would have dressed differently from the way that you're dressed. And for the younger generation, that becomes an issue, that inability to distinguish in terms of developing an identity. Because the younger generation, as is true for all ethnic groups, how do you become part of America? And for some of us, we didn't want to be part of the melting pot. I mean, for example, my wife believed in the melting pot. I was an Italian American. That's why I always saw myself, more kind of the multicultural approach. The earlier notion was the melting pot. That doesn't imply that she's older than I am. It implies simply that we have a different opinion on that. I just realized, well, logically one could run with that. But the reality of it is that Muslims in Europe and America, the second generation, have had to struggle with being both American, but then also being pressured when parents sometimes are saying, well, this is what a Muslim should be doing. Really what they're saying is, no, this is a Pakistani custom. Okay. The issue with regard to the pressure, I would say that the climate has been, and I'm not the only person that says this, there have been articles on this, that we function in this kind of, at times, neo-McCarthy-like period. I mean, for example, after 9/11, you had members of Congress being accused if they talked about the roots of terrorism or wanted to raise any criticisms as necessarily being unpatriotic. But for academics, you had something called Campus Watch, and I was among the top 12. You have a book put out by a fellow who publishes a very far-right magazine. He was a radical in the 60s, a radical leftist. Now he's a radical rightist. It's called 101 Most Dangerous Professors. I'm in that also. But regrettably, they didn't rank us, so I don't know. I might only be number 100, so there's nothing to be proud about for that. But that's an issue, and it continues to be an issue. If you Google my name, in fact, it's kind of funny because every time I did an interview in Bosnia, in Croatia at one point, and then I did an interview the other day, and you have newspaper people come in and say, "You're called this," so they know the name you're called because they go on the internet. You know, so and so says this about you, or so and so says you're an apologist for Islam. And I said, but I'm not a Muslim. But more interestingly, if they call me an apologist for Islam, then what are they? Does that mean that they are enemies of Islam? That they are, but that's an issue. So in other words, that is out there, and that climate is there. There also have been, these groups have gone to Congress and asked that funding for all major Middle East centers be done away with, or else that they all be monitored. And more recently, two prominent academics have started their own alternative Middle East Studies and African Studies associations, saying that the mainstream group is too much to the left. So, there is that tension within the academic community, and that's not a Muslim non-Muslim issue at all.
Gentleman here, yes, please. Please identify yourself.
Hello. Wonderful. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Omar Zaid, Philadelphia boy, South Philly, and now on the faculty over at ISTAC as research fellow. Thank you very much for your presentations. Nice to see you here. Okay. I wonder if you would care to comment on Louis Farrakhan and the position of the black Muslims in America, how they are viewed, how have they integrated with the immigrant Muslim community, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a very good question. I think, first of all, it depends on the age of the person. If you're an older American, older Americans will remember the black Muslim movement in particular, and they'll remember that. I can even remember about 25 years ago, there was a chair in Islamic studies created in the Midwest, and I did the keynote, and during the question and answer period, a Muslim got up, and the person who was going to take the chair was a Pakistani Muslim. But the person in the audience got up and kind of resentfully said, why is it that they equate us, we Muslims, like we mainstream Muslims, with the Nation of Islam? Because it was a concern. Now, the reality of it is, as you know, under Elijah Muhammad's son, under Warith ad-Din, the majority of African American Muslims have come into mainstream, if you will, mainstream Sunni Islam. But the fact is, only 5 years ago, when PBS was doing a show, and they called me up, and they were going to deal with African Americans, all they wanted to talk about was Farrakhan. And I said, well, we'll talk about Farrakhan, but the vast majority of African Americans don't follow Farrakhan. They follow Warith ad-Din. And even when we were taping, the woman would take a break and say, are you really sure we ought to be dealing with Warith ad-Din? Because, and I'm trying to get at the answer to realize that Farrakhan was bigger than life for a while. Farrakhan is an imposing man, physically, verbally, or in terms of his ability to speak, as well as, you know, the firebombs that he throws, which is attractive to the media. So Farrakhan, for example, would be on the front cover of a Time magazine, where Arthur Dean would not. Farrakhan has nowhere near the number of followers, but Farrakhan could do a million-man march and draw a huge crowd. In recent years, Farrakhan has gone quiet. Farrakhan has said that he has sees himself now as more mainstream, but there continue to be, you know, concerns among some as to, if not Farrakhan, who's been quiet, where some of his followers, you know, who were very anti-Jewish, as well as would be viewed as anti-white by many people, or separatist, where they come down. But in general, African Americans have blended in. I mean, your average younger American doesn't really think in terms of when they deal with, quote, your average African American Muslim, they don't think of Nation of Islam.
Abdullah Hassan.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to highlight some politicians, such as Dennis Kucinich. You mentioned about Keith Allison, but the mainstream politicians who have contact with the Muslim community, how they are performing and how the Muslim community viewing them, and how the mainstream politics looking at these politicians. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems that mainstream, for example, Muslims and Arabs who are not Muslims, Arab Christians, would wind up finding themselves in is that somebody like Dennis Kucinich or Ralph Nader are not electable. So they can like some of the policies that they articulate, but they're not electable. The interesting thing is that I would put it this way. There was a split among Muslims the first time President Bush ran. Okay? Immigrant Muslims not only voted a majority for President Bush, but they went public. And that got a lot of African American Muslims upset in the sense that when they went public, they felt that they were implying that this was a Muslim bloc vote. You know, and again, that just reinforced this sense. There's still, it's improving, but a tension between immigrant and indigenous. The indigenous feel we've always been here, you know, and the immigrants who are larger in number are acting like they're the spokespersons. The immigrants often say in the past, your issues are foreign, you're brushstroking us, our issues are domestic. You know, we're still dealing with issues of poverty, etc. So you had that kind of vote. Now, the second time President Bush ran, because of the policies, etc., the war in Iraq and a lot of other things, the community backed away. And I would say on this vote, unless Obama alienates in some, I can't imagine way, the overwhelming vote of Muslims will go a certain way. But other than that, I would say that if things were to stabilize, in many ways, the values of a significant percentage of American Muslims would lean towards either a conservative Democrat or a conservative Republican, but certainly could lean towards the Republican Party, because on sort of social issues, you know, on abortion rights, on the gay issue, etc., they would come down in the same place. They would differ on environment, but on those issues. And also, although, again, this profile's changing, but one of the things that I've said to American Muslim community is, you will know that your community's becoming more integrated when you start voting Republican. I come from a lifelong Democratic Party. But the history of our country is that generally, you know, the new ethnics, the new people will tend to vote Democrat. As with a lot of Italian Americans today, even within my own family, we've had some defectors, but we can only pray that they come back. But as they become sort of more economically, you know, as integrated and ascendant, they would go Republican. And so with regard to the future, and I think that's good. I mean, I don't think that you should, I think that if Muslims want to have influence, they ought to be courted by both parties. So if you just line up with one party, and then you lose the other party. And if they get in, you know, where do you go? That doesn't mean that on some issues they can't coalesce. So I think Muslims are in search of a candidate. I think right now Obama would be that candidate at the present moment.
Yes.
Prof. Esposito, I have two questions. The first one, I'd like to you to consider the China factor. This is probably looking a bit over the longer term. How do you see American-Islamic world relations in the context of the rise of China? And the second question is thoughts on possible Islamic reforms. Considering the intellectual and social conditions in America as compared to Europe or the wider Muslim world, how do you see developments in this area in the United States? Intellectual developments in the area of Islamic thoughts and reform. Thank you.
I don't get the meaning of the second question. I know you're talking about Islamic reform and governments in the area, but are you saying, do I see governments in the area engaging in Islamic reform? Or?
No, what I mean is that considering that the intellectual atmosphere in America is much freer than in most Muslim countries, and there are many more, possibly many more Muslim intellectuals in America compared to Europe. How do you see Islamic
that's
reform?
my superhighway speech. Yeah,
Yes.
no, I got that. Okay, that's my superhighway speech. Okay. With regard to the first, I can't answer that adequately. I mean, clearly the United States is going to have to face, as is Europe, the fact that the easy prediction is within a couple of decades, China and India will be major powers. You see this at the World Economic Forum. You know, I've been going there for a while, not that long, but it's so different. The last World Economic Forum, you know, you come out and you see, you know, who's CNN sticking a mic in the face of, you know? And it jars you initially because if you've been going to the WEF, it's usually, you know, all the pale faces, you know, Americans, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, etc. And suddenly, you know, you realize that it's, you know, they're dealing a lot with Chinese and with Indians, and even in panels or from the floor, you know, suddenly people will recognize, you know, these very, very prominently wealthy people from those countries. I think dealing with that reality, I remember President Clinton, after he left office, did a conference in New York. And one of the things he warned Americans about was A, they had to get their act together as leaders in terms of respect, B, economically, because C, he said it was conceivable to him within 50 years, whether we liked it or not, we were going to have to adjust to not being the paramount leader out there. I think, you know, that's an issue. In terms of the Muslim issue, I mean, you know, the only thing with China would be the Uyghurs, and it's very interesting what the Chinese have always been attempting to do and what they're attempting to do with the Uyghurs now. The second question on Islamic reform, I've actually written an article on it, and in my new book I'm dealing with it. I think one can argue that there is now, instead of a one-way highway, it's a two-way superhighway between the Muslim world and the West. For example, several years ago, we had the conference in Kuala Lumpur. And at the end, I asked people what they thought of the conference, and somebody got up and referred to me as the Don of the Temple Mafia. And I kept thinking, you know, Don, the Italian Don, you know, of the Temple Mafia. And I kept thinking, the Temple, I have my PhD from Temple, but I'm the first PhD in Islamic studies. And what they were saying was that so many of the people who came after me were from Southeast Asia, from Malaysia, Indonesia. And so I was seen as the Don of that group. So, you know, but what it was emphasizing was how many people in Southeast Asia now were getting their degrees from the US and others from the UK. And if you look at writing going back and forth, the influence of not only those who study in America and come back, or in Britain, like Osman or Kolish Majid and others, but also the influence of those who continue to be in America, their writings, both while they're alive and also, after they've died. I mean, people like Fazlur Rahman, people who are still alive today like Said Hussein Nasser, etc. So I think that there is that exchange, and I think that it's an important exchange, and there's an important role for American and European Muslims to play, because there is a more open environment. We don't have government-controlled or strongly influenced institutions to the same degree, and press, and the ability to do that kind of thinking. And so, for example, there's some very interesting stuff that's been done by Abdulaziz Sachedina on the Quran and religious pluralism. And he has a new book on Islam and human rights, which I think will be published in the next year. So I think that that's a definite, it's going on, and I think it will continue to go on.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Saadia Muhammad. I'm from the World Islamic Economic Forum, UITM International Center. In my visits in the US and in Europe and the UK recently, I think I've been impressed with my observations of how the younger generations, the Muslims' younger generations have assimilated, and then I've been more confident with the Islamic identity and the way they embrace Islam and practice Islam. And I would like to focus into the issue of gender and the issue of position of women, and because I seem to be, I mean, in my lectures also, there seem to be the same questions about, you know, the position of women and women in Islam. And my question is, are the Americans tend to see more of the images of Islam coming from outside America, coming from the Middle East and all that, and putting the stereotypes? Do they not see some of the lessons of Islam coming from the living practices of the American Muslims, coming from American Muslim women themselves, who may have interpreted and therefore have embraced Islam and have given probably a better example to what Islam ought to be than probably some of the practices in the Muslim countries themselves? How would you answer that?
It's coming about very slowly. I'll give you one major example. I had a former student, African American, first generation to go to college, okay? Simultaneously, she did both a law degree from Yale after she graduated from Georgetown and a PhD from Princeton University. She finished the law degree, she's finishing her dissertation. She clerked for one of the top members of the Court of Appeals. She's already lived both in the Arab world and in Africa. I mean, she's a phenomenal woman. And I give you one, Syed Muhammad Saeed, his family, you know, his children, his boys, you know, Isa and Musa, his daughter, Nafisa, and his other daughters. Those examples are there. But my perception and my experience is that Islam still tends to be viewed on these issues, that for most Americans, they don't see yet the American Muslim community, members of it, as representative on these issues. So when the issue of women comes up and when the media generally covers it, it's overseas, you know. But you do have a very vibrant group of youth. Now, a significant number of youth have walked away. And I think that's one of the challenges in America and Europe too. It's a comment on not just on our society, it's a comment on many Muslim families who don't know how to deal with the culture-religion issue. And as a result, between the problems of adjusting to society that anybody would have, but also the pressures of family, one is sort of like rejecting both sides and then you're nowhere. So you have a lot of younger American Muslims who don't necessarily practice, etc., but a significant number do, young men, young women, and they're making their mark. I think it's going to be a while before that is seen. You know, I think, for example, the more that you have somebody like Keith Ellison, the more that you start to see American Muslim politicians, people in the media, but it gets difficult. You're the exception in the media if you want to be hired and you wear hijab, for example. You know, but the other thing is, because of the younger generation, you only really start to get noticed when you start moving into the more responsible positions. You know, that's when people begin to, for example, when I knew Italian Americans were making it, okay, it was when the president of Yale was Italian American. You see? Before that, I mean, because years ago, Italian Americans didn't go to the good schools, and then even when they did, they weren't really standing out. They were students. But when you know, when you start being, you know, the head of a university, when an Italian American is the head of the Chrysler company, when, you know, and we're beginning to get situations like that, but it doesn't stand out as much. So it's going to take a while.
United States Ambassador.
My name is Jim Keith. I'm the American ambassador here. First of all, I want to thank IAIS for giving us this terrific platform And Professor Esposito, thanks for making time and coming yet again to Malaysia. I was sorry to hear you say the words, "I'm concluding." It's been such a pleasure to listen to you speak on this subject. I wonder if, I guess I could betray my bias and I think there is a connection between two different things you said, but I wonder if I could ask you to comment on it. Early on, you made passing reference to Pearl Harbor, the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the treatment of many, but including Japanese Americans. And the logical inference there is that over time, we owned up to the fact that we had been, as a nation, scared by what happened, frightened into an overreaction, and then one can argue it took us too long, but eventually made that up to the extent that that's possible to Japanese Americans and others. You also commented on the current political climate, peer pressure, the chilling effect of much of what's being done and said. I wonder if there is a connection between those two, and would you project the same sort of thing, perhaps over too long a time, but from your experience, would you make that sort of a projection?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, I did a program, a BBC program with, and I'm going to say what this one person said, which isn't exactly what you're saying, so I'm not trying to change the way you framed it. But with somebody who runs a center for like civil liberties at a major university, and a center for democracy and civil liberties. But at one point, I pointed out the issue of, you know, you've got 5,000 or 6,000 people arrested, you know, and at the end of the show, this person said, well, you know, Professor Esposito is talking about it, this is a problem, but it really isn't, because after all, they were freed. And I said, well, if you're one of the 5,000 or 6,000 and you're held for a while indefinitely, and then if you're not one of the 5,000 or 6,000 and you think it could happen to me, it's an issue. I think that there is an interesting comparison here. What I worry about is that we don't learn from that experience. And for example, I gave a talk to a group of high-powered CEOs, and one or two of them, when I brought up the Japanese experience, said, it worked. And if it works, and I was saying, you know, we don't want to do that with Muslims. So I think that the example is important to remember, and that we need to bring it up in terms of saying we need to learn from it, you know, and therefore try to you know, not say, well, now it's happening to you, you've got to go through it. And the reason I bring this up is that I was recently in a situation where a very prominent member of the Senate gave a wonderful talk to a gathering of Muslims and Christians, but in the Q&A, when an American Muslim got up, and actually it was a Canadian Muslim, got up and said, you know, we worry about our children and the impact on our children and what's going on, and this has to kind of be stopped. In effect, as a brilliant young woman with a PhD from one of our top universities said in characterizing his response, she said, in effect, what he said is, suck it up. I.e., it happened to other groups, it's your turn. Now, it wasn't quite, but it really did come down. But what was ironic was that the speechwriter for that senator sent me an email and said, gee, it was so well received, and it was, the speech was, but the speechwriter himself didn't pick up on dropping the ball on that. But you're absolutely right. I think that that's, you know, what I say on the lesser things is that certainly the comparison with ethnic groups and the amount of time it takes to integrate, move up through the system, get the influence, all of that's in place. And even the problems of at times, problems with indiscriminate arrests that other groups went through. I mean, you know, issues even about mafia, et cetera. But I think it's the more high-profile stuff that becomes a real, you know, a real issue. And I think that's what's worrisome. I mean, when you have a situation where, for example, I give talks in the U.S. at big university talks, but also speak to Muslim groups, and I will have Muslims from the audience come out and say, you know, in effect, I'm mainstream, I'm doing well, but I'm afraid to give money to any charity. You know, it's that kind of chilling effect that I think we're struggling with, and we're going to have to work through. We're going to have to learn those lessons.
Okay, the last two questions perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, the easiest way to end, of course, is to say it's almost time for prayer. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Abdul Ghani Muhammadur Raji from Istak. Thank you, our professor. I would like to have your comment about the reason for the fast expansion of Islam in America in this within just 10 years to this time. Is there any reason for that? Because Islam is expanding in America in a way that it doesn't exist in another place. I would like to have your comment. And second, Sufism is part of our civilization, Islamic civilization. The Sufis play any role in this expansion in America over there or not? Thank you very much.
Yeah, first of all, the expansion, I would say, has been significant for a variety of factors. One, certainly before 9/11, for a number of decades, immigration. Two, very important is two, Muslims have larger families. A, they have families, and B, larger families. And three, conversions. Conversions due to intermarriage, as well as simply people embracing Islam. And so I think most people would agree, there may be a big debate about the number of Muslims in America, but most people would agree that Islam is the fastest growing religion in America. And so, I mean, although we were predicting 20 years ago that in 20 years it would be the second largest, certainly I would say, given the trends in the foreseeable future, it will be the second largest religion after Christianity, given the growth rate. The Sufis. Sufis are playing a significant role, particularly in terms of conversions and followers, because the Sufism presents a very, well, first of all, it emphasizes spirituality and a very flexible, and there's a whole element of Islam in America that is what one of my Muslim students from the Gulf calls no Islam, which is not that attractive, i.e. a hardcore Salafi approach is not going to be that attractive, for example, for converts, or at least not for many converts. So Sufism, in terms of emphasizing spirituality.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for your inspiring lecture. My own is not a question, but rather a brief comment. I'm Ahmed Fauzi from Istak. When you are giving the lecture, you made mention that American lady, she said that the husband friends asked her to cover in a way, a modern way. And you said that that one is not Islamic, but it's Sudanese way. So I just want to mention that Islam, whether it's Sudanic way or Pakistani way, as long as the body is covered in Islam, Islam recognizes that one and it is Islamic, whether in Indonesia or Africa.
No, that's the point. But my point to the woman was that the reason they were telling her that was the Islamic way to dress was that they were Sudanese. See, they weren't saying this is the Sudanese Islamic way. She's not Sudanese. And she's an American, born in America, living in America. And so what I was saying to her is that Muslim women dress differently in different countries, and they're dressed Islamically. You know, how they dress modestly really varies culturally. And so my sense was you can wear, if you will, whatever it means to say American clothes, since they're made in Malaysia and Taiwan. But anyway, you can wear American fashions. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are not in a position to entertain any more questions. But I'm sure you share with me that we have benefited from Professor John Esposito's talk. We have been better informed, I hope, about the question of the situation of the American Muslim community. And also we have been enlightened or have been given new perspectives of looking at the future relations of United States and the Islamic world. Of course, this is a very, very big topic. I'm sure there are many, many issues that will engage us in the near future. And I think in the relationship continues to be a very interesting one and going to have a major impact on the world as a whole. I would just like to take this opportunity, bringing this to a close. So on behalf of the Institute and on behalf of the audience, we'd like to thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Esposito, and let's give a big applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And the